everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Tuesday session. We're going to be featuring two speakers, and the key theme here is skills to confronting uncertainty. And as one of our speakers, we have my good friend here, Rahul Daswani, who is from Singapore. He has long been in a wide range of industries, from government to consulting to education. And I'm very happy to have Rahul to come and share his insights on how do we deal with uncertain times. So Rahul, thank you so much for your time. And, please say a few words to our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. Always great to be here and speak with you. I am excited to talk about the idea of uncertainty because even though it is scary, there's actually a lot of opportunity that comes with uncertainty. So looking forward to exploring this topic further with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rahul. This topic is really about, we have a lot of noises and, confusing signals out there. And in a way, we are perplexed. We can often describe our world as VUCA, very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But despite that, it is also our responsibility to really identify what are these important signals that we have to be mindful of so that we are able to better prepare for anything that might come, whether we are able to foresee or not foresee it. We got to be able to identify these important signals. Now, my first question to you, Rahul, tell us about what do you mean by thinking like a futurist? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure, Samuel. So thinking like a futurist is really helpful in this time of uncertainty because the idea is not necessarily to predict the future. If anybody told me I could predict exactly what the new normal is going to look like and when it would be, I would probably run away from them. So the idea is not necessarily prediction, but really to come up with plausible alternatives. So plausibility is striking the right balance between something that is, there's a whole array of possibilities, a wide range out there, and you really want to focus on the things that are plausible, because if you focus on the things that are too outlandish, too crazy, people won't listen to you. At the same time, on the other hand, if you focus on things that are too probable, too likely to happen, you're not really adding much value. So really the sweet spot as a futurist is thinking about something that is plausible, but also something that is not so probable and not already in the business as usual plans. So that's the whole idea about thinking like a futurist, is to think about the things that are plausible and then coming up to, if there are elements of this future that are preferred that you really like, then you want to go into, okay, how do I achieve that? And if there are elements of a plausible future that you don't like, how do I navigate myself out of a situation that I end up there? And that's why you want it to be predictive, because if you predict a bad situation, you want to be able to do something about it so that you don't end up there. So that's really what future thinking is all about.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a spot on. I mean, well said. I really resonate with what you said. So in speaking of which, times like this right now, it's a very, we can call this hyper uncertainty. The COVID-19 has impacted us in all levels of our lives. So how would you, see what it was like, before COVID-19 and now, now COVID-19 is, with us. What are some of the major, changes that you see taking place, and how do you see that impacting us from your standpoint, from your perspective?
So one of the things that we're seeing is actually some of the fundamentals are remaining constant, but they're accelerating a lot. And that's actually a trend that you've seen over the last 100 or 200 years. If you look at things like population growth and how it skyrocketed over the last 100 years, if you look at things like consumption, GDP growth, electronics, a lot of this stuff has just accelerated a lot. And in COVID, you're seeing a lot more of this acceleration happen. Trends like the hollowing out of the middle in different things, some of the tasks that are automated, some of the things that are going to be offshore or done by automation or artificial intelligence, you're seeing an acceleration of that. It was already beginning to happen before COVID, but you're seeing a big acceleration of that happening. And not just in the workforce, even in schools, you're seeing the hollowing out of a lot of these middle tier educational tertiary institutes. People are wondering, hey, is it a lot of value to send my kids to a place where it's just the middle? I'd rather either send them to the really top of the line schools where you get the networks, you get that kind of quality, or you get an online education, which is free and consistently now of increasingly a certain level of quality that is sufficient. So you're seeing the hollowing out, which was a trend from before, but what you're seeing in COVID times is a great acceleration. That's the first thing. The second
Yes.
thing you're seeing
Yeah.
is that the desire for certainty in humans is
Uh-huh.
just such a big thing, right? I mean, you're seeing that everybody's asking, what is the next normal going to look like? When is it going to happen? When is the vaccine coming out? And this
Right.
desire for certainty is just so fundamental to the human experience and what we become accustomed to in our generation growing up, and partly because of this instant gratification idea. So what you really want to focus on is how can you inoculate yourself or at least deal with a wider array of possibilities of futures
Mm.
and continue to prepare yourself for these futures, not necessarily knowing with certainty what's going to happen, because that will really then put you ahead of a lot of people who are close to you. So that's the second, and I'll just end with the third one, is that even though nobody knows exactly what the new normal is like,
Yeah.
there is a set of things, attitudes, beliefs, skills that you can have so that you make sure you're well poised, right? You see, even though there's a recession, you see a lot of companies who have managed to pivot quite quickly and take advantage of that. So if you are quick, you're already seeing that people are able to take advantage of this. A recession or economic issue is not new. We've had recessions before. And companies like Uber, like Airbnb, which are huge today, were actually born in the previous recession. So really a time of recession is a time for reinvention and opportunity. And so if you're just aware and you're able to pivot quickly, then you'll be able to really ride this wave really, really well.
Well, I mean, I like what you said, challenge, generate new opportunities. And you mentioned earlier about we shouldn't be just aiming for probable, right, future, which are basically what other people are able to speculate and expect, but rather go for plausible, which is a much more of a wider scope. Now, if you want to identify these plausible futures, right, you should be able to, again, understand what are these key trends or key driving forces per se. And you should be able to somehow, even to a level of translating or interpreting how that's going to impact you and, start preparing accordingly. So towards our audience, if I were to ask you this question about what are the 2 to 3 or even up to 4 sort of skills or the mindsets that you need to have in order to identify these plausible futures, identify some of these driving forces which you can then again interpret and start anticipating and preparing for it, what could they be?
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on the right nails on the head, Samuel. So the first one is certainly identifying the driving force. How do you do that, right? So you want to maintain a wide array of sources. Today it's really easy to be caught up in your echo chambers, in the same groups of people, in the same
Right.
news sources, and all the algorithms are geared towards getting you to spend more time reading. And how they do that is
Yeah.
to feed you things that reinforce your point of view. So the
Exactly.
first way to do it is to curate a wider range of sources, right? And certainly one way to do that is to intentionally subscribe to non-curated news. So news that is produced a bit more traditionally, right, by well-researched journalists and across different political spectrum and beliefs. So if you have that out there, not just traditional news sources, but also non-traditional people who are thinkers, and Twitter is a place that a lot of these people hang out. And so if you are able to curate a range of sources and you use things like machine learning
Right.
and neural language programming to be able to source out what are the key signals that are happening, you begin to see some trends happening earlier, right? So you see what's happening on the fringes, and that's how you avoid the trap of falling in the probability. You look at kind of what's emerging, what's fresh, what's new, and what are some of these people doing. And so if you are able to have a wide set that is curated well, that'll begin to inform you what the trends are. So that's the first step. How you do it and move it out into the future and what's happening in the future, not just the trends now, is really if you can use an idea or a tool called the futures wheel. And really what that's about is taking a driving force. So let's say, for example, automation and work from home, right? Let's even take two and combine them. And you think about not just what this trend means directly, but what are the implications of this trend into a second order effect, right? So what happens with more automation and with more working from home? What does that mean for the kind of use of spaces? Are space usages gonna change? And if so, what are potentially more optimal ways of allocating our spaces, both as communities and organizations, but also as governments or as larger communities or the social sector? What does that mean? What are people going to need? And how do we organize ourselves differently, right? So you're beginning to see, even just by one example, by just going out to a second order, it begins to pose questions that really open up a lot of possibilities through using this idea of the futures wheel or second order or even third order impacts of a driving force that you identify that is happening, right? And then finally, I'll just make a point about the communication elements, because, as you know, a lot of people are quite busy fighting what's urgent fires now. So how do you get them to think about things that might have an impact 10, 15, 20 years down the road? And really, as somebody who's thinking about the future, it is your responsibility to help bring that back into what that means now. What can I do today about this? Why is it urgent? And that's an area where the climate change movement hasn't done particularly well over the past decade or two, right? Because everybody says, hey, it's not an urgent problem. Even though there's an uptick of forest fires and natural disasters, it's not super urgent. And now we're beginning to use language like climate emergency to tell people, actually, this is a real issue now. So what's the way in which you can do that in your traditional forms of communication, like reports or long form articles, actually are not going to do the job. The goal is, how can you emotionally engage people and get people to feel what it might be like to live in one of these worlds. And you should have either extreme, right? You want people to feel really excited about a world that is really preferred, there's outcomes that you really enjoy and you're looking forward to. But you also want people to feel really scared, really frustrated about living in a world that has really, really scary consequences for them and for other people. So what are the ways you can design experiences? Are there games that you can get people to play? Are there different videos that are immersive, or even short movies that you can film that get people into that world such that they start changing their perspective and rethinking how they do things today? So that's really the key, to be creative about ways that you engage people such that it's so emotional for them that they rethink, and sometimes it might even keep them up at night. It might go into their dreams. It might become nightmares for them. And that's when you know you've hit the nail on the head and you've brought people from the future into the present so that they take action today. And that's really what you want to do.
Right. Fantastic. Fantastic. I mean, these are really, really important and really useful for times like this. My next question, as I hear you speak, are you able to share with us some of the examples of how, on an individual level or even an organizational level or even up to a country level, somehow putting the COVID-19 context or even beyond that, are there any individuals or organizations or even governments who are actually using, for example, things like Future Will or others that you have mentioned to, in a way help better prepare for these uncertainties?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at, so I'll do organizations, right? Because there are quite some examples of how people have done it quickly. And it seems quick only because they've already thought about it from before and started experimenting and started looking into it, right? So I think a really good example is if you look at Shell and BP's recent announcements about pivoting quite quickly, it seems, into the renewable energy space. It seems quick on the surface, but actually that's because they have used tools like the Futures Wheel or scenario planning to already envision a world where oil is depleted, where actually renewable energy is not just technologically feasible, but economically it makes sense to invest in it. Shell has been using scenarios since the 1980s. They're actually one of the pioneers of scenario planning. And because they were able to think about a world differently, where fossil fuels was actually not necessarily the dominant mode of energy, they were able to pivot already in the 80s and 90s into investing into renewable energy. And that makes their transition today much easier and much smoother. And that's why they were one of the first energy companies to announce their switch. And for them, they've already been going along this trend because they've identified it, right, at a much, much earlier time. If you think about some of the other organizations that have pivoted quite quickly as a result of thinking about this, you look at Spotify, right, which is itself a new business model
Right.
of how do we have a premium subscription, subscribing to music, pay small royalties, as opposed to the big royalties from music production companies. And so they realized in the pandemic that actually just advertising revenues alone was not sufficient and people were slashing their advertising budget. And so they decided to pivot into doing content creation. But they have a really solid foundation, right? And they were already thinking
Right.
about what are the ways that we can diversify, because you don't want to be in a situation where you only have one possible future and then that's the only one, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So they were thinking about actually what is a way in which you can diversify. And so they launched into content creation, much like Netflix did as well, right? So Netflix also moved quite quickly into original content. For a long time, people said Netflix was never really going to go anywhere because they didn't have original content creation. And Netflix thought about that and said, okay, we do want to diversify our value proposition to our customers. So how is it that we can do that? And Netflix diversified not just the content itself, but actually how you ran the company,
Right.
the kind of transparency that they have, even internally in the company, about how much people earn, about how much leave you take, and having these kinds of more foresighted policies enable them to also then attract the best kind of talent and the best minds. And it reinforces you in this positive spiral and positive loop to be able to then think about, wow, I have so all these possibilities ahead of me. If you look at alcohol companies, small distillery companies in the US pivoted really quite quickly, and they changed their KPIs too, right? So instead of how many bottles of alcohol and how much have you sold it, they changed their KPIs to can we produce hand sanitizer, and how many bottles of hand sanitizer are we producing at what rate, right? And so you want to be able to take advantage of these trends. I'll give you a last example at a smaller scale, right? So we've gone from big to a smaller scale. There is a woman called Narina, who actually does pasta making workshops in Rome, 1 hour outside of Rome. And she, of course, the business was hit very hard because Italy was hit very hard by COVID. And so her granddaughter, she's 80 plus years old, and her granddaughter basically helped her move her business online. So taking advantage of some of these trends, and people who can't travel anymore, but also want some kind of experience, want to be out in the farm, can we create a virtual experience to help them experience what it's like to make pasta and expose them to that kind of travel experience that they want? And so she created her own site. And so now a lot of people are able to have some kind of that experience that they wanted. And she's able to have a sustainable business also, and learning new skills and always having this content upskilling to be able to pivot into the new economy. So at all levels, actually, people are thinking about this and using it well in order to transition quite well into what the new normal is going to be like, even though we don't know exactly what the final product is going to be and when it's going to look like.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all these examples. These are really powerful examples. My next question, as you're speaking, also kind of generated this question. I want to bring it down to more of an individual or personal level, right? So as a person who's having to, be mindful of all these changes, and in a way, it's impacting every aspect of our lives, right? So as we somehow navigate through this, we're not sometimes sure whether we are on the right path or not, or we're not really sure what we are doing, or whether we are investing the right time into the right things. So how do we really understand whether we are on the right path, or how do we really understand what I'm doing right now is going to actually help me to better understand or better navigate through these uncertainties? How do you want to advise an individual who asks you this question?
Yeah, it's interesting, Samuel, because I think in the past, either people didn't grapple enough with this question or it seemed very intuitive, right? So this is coming a lot now, that question of purpose, what's my calling? Am I on the right path? Should I switch paths? And people have almost these quarter life crises and these midlife crises, right? To think about what you're doing in the past. And really there are three things that I would suggest, as you may remember, I've also been training to be a life coach. And interestingly, a lot of the questions that people ask are around this subject, around purpose. So the first thing I would say is you need to reconnect with yourself. And I'm certainly guilty of this as well, because we're so invested in doing everything now. Everything seems so urgent. We've lost touch with ourselves. And the specific advice is look at connecting with yourself in three ways, right? So first, look at yourself physically. What is your body telling you? Sometimes my body will say, hey, I just need a break. I'm tired. I need to go for a run. I need to meditate, I need to do something. And sometimes we shove that aside and we say, no, there's no time for this. I need to get this out. This deliverable is due urgently. But really listen, start listening
Right,
more
right.
to what your body is telling you. Pay attention to where your body is taking you. Are your legs taking you somewhere? Do you have tiredness in particular places of your body that signal the need for rest? And pay attention. What are you drawn towards? Like, what are you physically moving towards? And if you pay more attention to that, then suddenly you begin to have new insights into what energizes you, right?
Right.
That's really something that can
Yes.
help guide you. If I think about, not just think about, if I recall back in time in some of my jobs, where of course they're all jobs, you know, there's some parts that you enjoy and some parts you don't, but if you really pay attention to when am I most engaged at work, and where am I walking towards, and where am I excited, where's my body most excited, that for me was a calling to shift myself away from some of the strategy and policy roles into the more people development. I felt really energized. I was excited when I was speaking to people who were looking to find out what their potential is and invest in that. So that
Right.
to me was like, oh, my body is excited when that happens, and that's a signal for me to critically examine what my own path is and whether I should consider. The second thing to pay attention to is your emotions,
Right.
right? And again, this is something that sometimes we learn. You know, there's a bit of a gender element sometimes. You know, as a man growing up, you know, you heard this: real men don't cry. But really, if you're invested and you're interested and you're curious
Right.
about your emotions and you don't judge yourself, and I used to judge myself for sometimes getting overwhelmed by emotions, but instead now I'm like, okay, I'm feeling this sadness. What is really going on? And sometimes it's hard to link that directly to a particular cause, and that's okay. But it's about being with that emotion. What
Mm-hmm.
am I really feeling now? And sometimes it's a mix of emotions. And the more we practice,
Mm-hmm.
the more we are able to give name to these things. I actually struggle sometimes to name something. Is it grief? Is it sadness? Is it anger? What is it? But
Right.
I can describe my feelings. For me, sometimes it's better if I draw. If I free write with my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand for me, and I free
Right.
write what is really going on, right? And sometimes I feel a particular weight, and I just talk about it in those things. Sometimes I feel attracted to lying down on the floor. You know, what does that feeling
Mm-hmm.
translate to? I can't describe in normal feeling words, but I can describe what it feels like to me. And so that also is a really nice signal to say, hey, what's going on here? Let me take a pause, and enough connection to emotions,
Right.
then you begin to see what are some of the patterns. Are you close to particular people when particular emotions happen?
Mm.
Are you doing particular tasks when particular emotions strike you? What is really going? Are you thinking about particular things? Right. And so the third dimension is really about the intellectual thoughts. What are the thoughts that are coming up? And again, sometimes these things happen so fast, we begin to think, actually, I'm not in control of my
Mm.
thoughts.
Mm.
But if you observe them more, what are the patterns that emerge? How do I think about what my career is? What kind
Right.
of role I'm in?
Mm-hmm.
What are the words that play into my head regularly? And that gives us some insight into where we are, and helps us make that connection back to who we are and where we are. And then from there, once you have that connection, some of the I'll just leave you with a few guiding questions to consider. Really, the main thing is about connection with yourself. But some of the questions that are really, really useful, that I found really useful, is, you know, if you close your eyes and you could dream about what your life looked like in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, what would that look like? And try and do something that is against your natural instinct, right? So for me, I use words a lot. I use ideas a lot. I'm not so invested in the emotion and physical. So I want to do something physical to get me into that space. And so I closed my eyes and I drew a picture of, you know, what that might be like in 15 or 20 years, and really go outside of yourself and do something creative. So there's the dreaming element that you want to ask yourself. You want to ask yourself, what's really going on for me, right? And you take that physical, that intellectual, the emotional parts of it, and you think holistically, what's going on for me? Where do I want to go? What's stopping me from getting there? You know, if you have this clear idea where you want to go, and you have this clear idea about where you are now, what's getting in the way? And if you really,
Right.
really understand that, only then can you begin to articulate what are the possibilities that are ahead for you. So really, for me, I learned a lot by thinking about what is really my core purpose and thinking about how can it. So for me, it's really about helping people, the maximum number of people, identify their potential and reach there. And where I am now, where I was a few years ago, was not really geared towards making that a reality. It was not. It's an organization that didn't value that as a skill set or as an objective. So that was unfortunate. And so for me, I knew that meant I had to change the organization that I was a part of so that I could be somewhere that had that alignment with my calling. And so I had to make that. That meant a big transition for me. And I made that transition because it was very aligned to what my goal was. But if I had not had that clarity around what my dream was, if I had not that clarity about where I was in my position, and that denial about, sometimes we say, oh, it's not really that bad. And I was like, it's not that bad. I'm doing reasonably well, but is it aligned to where I want to go? And once you have that discovery, then it really opens up fundamental questions about what you want to do about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that you have so much to say, and I really, do find, the audience will find it very useful of what you have shared. But in the interest of time, and of course, we're going to be having a live Q&A session with you later on. But, as a last question, if I were to ask you, what are those 2 or 3 buzzwords, that kind of encapsulates or it summarizes what you have shared? What would they be? Just, come up with 2 or 3 words.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you 3, right, Samuel? So the first is competence. So you want to think about what are the competencies that are going to be required in this world where you expand on future trends, right? So the trend thing, use your futures wheel, go elaborate about it and think about what competencies are going to be required. What are the intersections that you might be able to play in? For me, it's technology, it's human resources, human capital, and government and startups, right? These are the things that I'm excited by. So what are the competencies that are required? They're going to set me in good shape, right? And in competencies, I think one thing to share and elaborate on is it's quite hard to be, if you want to create impact because of the hollowing out, you want to be at the top 1%, right? And it's going to be really hard to be the top 1% of a single competency because you have to beat all the other 99%. But there's a hack to this. And so if you are at the intersection, so for example, like I said, I'm at the intersection of technology, human capital, and government. If I'm just at the best 20% in each of them, I'm just at 20% best of technology, of HR. If you multiply that, right? If 20%, that's 20%,
right,
4%, and 4% times 20%, that's already the top 1%. So all I have to do in a way is be the top 20% of 3 disciplines at an intersection, and that carves out my own competency. So think about and use intersections really well to then be able to get yourself into zones of competence. Okay. Second one is going to be contribution. Where do you feel your best as a contributor? What are the ways in which you can take your role as most effective? And I really like the framework of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. I don't know if you've heard this one. But the idea is pioneers are people go out and really create something. And I love doing that. That's why I do so many government startups, because I love going out, really fundamentally rethinking how the system might be drastically different and doing that. Some other people might like settlers, which is like, okay, like I see this idea. How am I going to make this for my small village or for my small organization? How do I get pockets of these? And some people really like the massive town planning. How do I think about this in a massive way for the entire public service, for the whole government, for the whole country? Right. And so if you think about your contribution, where is your contribution going to be best served? And again, here where you relook internally at your physical body, at your intellectual thoughts and your emotions, that can help you figure out where your contributions are going to be best. And finally, the third one is going to be your commitment. Where is your heart at? What are you going to commit to? What is your calling? And so if you find that, and what is the ultimate goal? Because then that helps you focus on something. So for example, for me, my calling is certainly on helping people find their potential and navigate there. And whether it is through my job in HR now and designing systems for people, whether it is through one-on-one coaching, whether it's through teaching adaptive leadership and futures thinking with you, Samuel, elsewhere, my calling is the same. And so there are different paths that I can achieve. But because I focus on my commitment, that really energizes me to go forward. So thinking about the competence that you can build, that's going to be relevant for the world, thinking about your own contributions and whether
Right.
it's going to be best. And finally, think about your own commitment and what you're going to commit to, because that's going to really energize you and drive you forward. So that's the last thing I'll leave you with, Samuel.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I've learned the three C's there. I'll start, putting that into practice myself. Rahul, thank you so much for sharing all your invaluable insights with us. I know that there's going to be a lot of questions for the audience out there. If you have any questions, burning questions, anything that you might want to ask Rahul to learn more about anything that he has shared, please see you on Saturday, the November 21st. We're going to have a live Q&A session during which you'll be able to speak directly with Rahul. So Rahul, you've spoken about the skills and the mindsets to confront uncertainties, and especially in times like this, COVID-19. I think what you have shared is really, truly useful. So thank you very much, Rahul. I hope to see you in the live Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Samuel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.